The crisp air of Lost Valley, Wyoming, was biting and still, as the sun dipped low behind the rugged mountain peaks. The sky, streaked with fiery orange and purple hues, was a stark contrast to the cold emptiness below. Everything in the valley felt frozen in time, silent, waiting. The small town was barely a dot on the map, hidden among the vast stretch of plains and dense, unyielding woods. There, in the heart of this forgotten place, stood Joanna Ray, her boots heavy on the worn earth, staring at the old ranch she was about to leave behind forever. Her mother's place, the home that had been both a haven and a cage, loomed before her, empty and forgotten. The barn, long unused, stood like a silent witness to years of both love and loss. Her bags were packed, sitting in the bed of her truck, ready for a journey that would take her far away from this place and the memories tied to it. She'd come back for one last goodbye, but as far as she was concerned, the town and the ranch could keep their ghosts. But as she turned to take a final walk through the woods, the weight of her decision pressing down on her, something caught her attention. A movement. Not a squirrel, nor a deer, but something far more profound. Out of the shadows stepped a wild Mustang. It was large, its coat a haunting gray that almost seemed to shimmer in the dying light of the day. It stood still in front of her, its eyes locked with hers, unblinking. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Joanna's heart skipped a beat. The Mustang didn't run. It didn't even flinch. It just stood there, watching her, as if it had been waiting for her all along. She took a tentative step forward, then another. The horse didn't move, nor did it make a sound. It was like it was daring her to make the first move, to come closer, and against all reason, against the very part of her that told her to leave, she felt herself drawn toward it. Her feet moved almost involuntarily, as if some unseen force was guiding her, pulling her deeper into the woods. She wasn't sure why she was following the horse. She didn't even fully believe in the stories about the valley being haunted by spirits of the past. But there was something in the air now. A feeling she couldn't shake. A pull she couldn't resist. The Mustang turned, its mane flowing like a banner behind it, and with one last glance back, it trotted into the woods. Joanna, despite her uncertainty, followed. The forest was dense and quiet, the trees pressing in around her as she moved deeper into the thicket. Her boots crunched softly on the frost-covered ground, the only sound in the heavy silence. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, but there was something else, a sharp, metallic tang in the air that Joanna couldn't place. She glanced around, but all she saw were shadows and towering trees. The Mustang's presence, though, was undeniable. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, she began to wonder if she'd made a mistake. Her hands were trembling, her breath coming in soft bursts, but there was no turning back. She couldn't explain it, but she knew this path wasn't just about leaving. It was something more, something had drawn her here, and now she had no choice but to see it through. Eventually the trees opened into a small clearing, and there, nestled among the rocks and overgrown brush, stood a weather-worn cabin. It looked abandoned, the roof sagging under the weight of time, the windows dark and empty. Yet, in some strange way, it felt alive, like it had been waiting. The Mustang, still in front of her, paused and looked back, then trotted away, disappearing into the woods once more. Joanna stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. If she could leave. She could turn around and forget all of this, forget the Mustang, forget the strange pull in her chest, forget the eerie sense of destiny. But something in her hesitated, something deep inside urging her forward. She stepped up to the cabin, the old wood creaking beneath her feet. The door hung loosely on its hinges, swaying slightly in the wind, as if it, too, was undecided. A thin layer of snow dusted the ground inside the cabin, and as she pushed open the door, she was greeted by the faint scent of dust and something else, something that felt far older. Then she saw him. Lying near a cold, crumbling fireplace was an old man, his skin pale, his body gaunt. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, but he was unconscious, his face twisted in pain. Joanna's heart raced. She dropped to her knees beside him, immediately assessing his condition. His pulse was weak, his lips cracked from dehydration. Without a second thought, she set her bags down and began to work. Years of training as an emergency nurse kicked in as she found a small first aid kit tucked inside a drawer. She worked quickly, her hands steady as she rehydrated him, checked for injuries, and wrapped him in the warmth of a blanket she found near the fireplace. As she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just tending to a stranger. There was something deeply familiar about this place, as if it were meant to be found, and she, somehow, had been the one to find it. Minutes later, the man's eyes fluttered open. At first, they were clouded with confusion, his vision blurry. But as his gaze sharpened and locked on hers, a strange flicker of recognition passed through him. "You're not her," he rasped, his voice rough with dehydration. "You're not the one I've been waiting for." Joanna frowned, unsure how to respond. She wasn't sure who this man thought she was, but it didn't matter. Right now, all that mattered was getting him to safety. But there was something in his words, something that gnawed at the edges of her mind. She gently pressed his shoulders down to the cold floor. "Who are you?" she asked softly, her voice steady but tinged with curiosity. The old man closed his eyes again, his hands trembling as he raised them slightly, as if reaching for something only he could see. "My name is Nathaniel Creed," he whispered, "and I've come here to find the truth about my son." Joanna Ray hadn't set foot in Lost Valley for years. The town, once a cradle of her childhood, now felt like a relic of another life, one she had long since left behind. Growing up here had been a bittersweet experience, filled with both love and loss. But it was the kind of place that had no room for someone like her anymore. She had outgrown it, and it had outgrown her. Her memories of Lost Valley were tangled with the scent of hay in the barn, the sound of horses' hooves on the dirt path, and her mother's soft yet firm voice calling her inside as the sun dipped below the horizon. Her mother, Evelyn Ray, had been a stoic woman, never one for emotion or grand gestures. But her love for Joanna had been there, in the way she worked tirelessly to keep the ranch afloat after her father's sudden death, in the way she would sit beside Joanna at night, telling stories of how they had come to call this barren place home. But none of those memories helped her now. Joanna stared at the dusty old ranch as she sat in her truck, the engine running, its soft hum a reminder of how easy it would be to just, drive away. There was nothing left for her here, not anymore. She had sold the land, the only thing tying her to this place, and was heading to a new life, somewhere far from the ghosts of her past. The loss of her mother earlier that year had sent a sharp, irrevocable pain through her, something she hadn't yet fully processed. It had been sudden. Her mother's health had deteriorated so quickly that Joanna didn't have time to say goodbye, didn't have time to make things right. That's why she was leaving. Her life as an emergency nurse had left her burned out, emotionally and physically. The trauma, the lives lost on her watch, the endless nights with no time for herself, it had all taken its toll. So when her mother's death came, it had been the final straw. Joanna had walked away from it all. She left her position in the emergency room, packed up what little she had, and bought a one-way ticket out of the city, thinking that being away from the chaos would somehow heal her. But now, standing here on the land that had once been home, Joanna was more uncertain than ever about what the future held. She knew she wasn't the same person who had left all those years ago. And back then, she had been hopeful, eager to prove herself in the world. But that world, filled with its expectations and the constant noise of people's needs, had broken her down. She had become someone distant, emotionally detached, always keeping her walls up. She thought she had found peace in leaving it all behind. But now, as she stared at the ranch, she realized she had only buried her pain, not healed from it. The town wasn't any better. The streets were nearly deserted. the buildings weathered and cracked from years of neglect. Lost Valley was a town that time had forgotten, much like her. She had once been the talk of the town. Her father's promising legacy and her mother's quiet determination had cast a long shadow. But Joanna had always felt like an outsider, too much of a dreamer for the dirt and dust that seemed to permeate the valley. It had taken a while for her to leave. Too long, really. Her mother's insistence on staying here, even as the world changed around them, had always baffled Joanna. But now, with her mother gone, she was finally free. Free to leave the past behind, to find a new life. Somewhere else. But something had shifted, the Mustang. As soon as it appeared in her path, she had felt a stirring in her chest. A flicker of something familiar. Something she hadn't even known she had been searching for. And when it didn't run, when it just stood there and stared at her with those deep, knowing eyes, something inside her snapped. It was as if the horse had been waiting for her, calling her back to something she had left behind long ago. She didn't know what it meant, but the feeling was undeniable. In that moment, as she stood at the edge of the woods, staring at the wild animal, Joanna knew that this place wasn't finished with her yet. She wasn't finished with it. And that was why she followed it. The Mustang had led her to the cabin, to the man lying unconscious on the cold floor, and that was where everything started to change. As she sat beside Nathaniel Creed, her mind raced. This man, lost and confused, was more than just an old stranger who had wandered into her life. There was something about him, something that tugged at her, as though they shared some unspoken connection. When he had spoken of his son, something had stirred inside her. She had seen that same kind of pain in her mother's eyes before she passed away. The kind of pain that came from unanswered questions, from things left unsaid. Joanna had spent so much of her life running from pain, from the unanswered questions that plagued her. But this felt different. The need to understand, to seek the truth, was something she could no longer ignore. Nathaniel's son, the one who had vanished years ago, seemed like a shadow of her own life. A son who had been searching for something his father couldn't provide. Someone who had uncovered secrets that led to his disappearance. It all felt eerily familiar. Joanna had spent so many years wondering about the choices her mother had made, the things she hadn't said, the truths that were buried deep in the past. Was this her chance to confront those ghosts? The pull of the past was becoming stronger with every step she took. It wasn't just about leaving anymore. Joanna knew that she had to face what was left behind, no matter how painful it might be. As she glanced down at Nathaniel, she realized that in some strange way they were both searching for the same thing: truth, understanding, closure, and maybe, just maybe, the Mustang was the key to it all. The Mustang had led her to the cabin, its presence lingering in the woods like a shadow, watching her every step. As Joanna sat by Nathaniel Creed, who was now unconscious and feverish, the feeling that something extraordinary was unfolding began to solidify. The Mustang had not only led her here, but had seemingly awakened something in her. A long dormant sense of purpose, as if the very land, the very air of Lost Valley, was calling to her, urging her to confront the past. She had never been one to believe in fate, but the path she had followed into these woods, following the wild horse, had taken her somewhere she couldn't ignore. Deep within her, she felt that the answers she sought were here, hidden beneath layers of time, waiting to be uncovered. The journey wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The cabin was small, its wooden walls sagging with age, its windows darkened by layers of dirt and neglect. The cold air had crept inside, but it felt oddly comforting, as if the cabin itself held secrets it was waiting to share. As Joanna continued to tend to Nathaniel, she couldn't shake the eerie sense that this place had seen much more than it seemed to show. The corners of the room were shrouded in shadow, the faded furniture and old trinkets like relics from a bygone era. The cabin felt like a portal into another time, one she wasn't sure she was ready to enter. But the Mustang's silent presence still lingering somewhere outside, made it clear that this was no ordinary moment. There was more to this place, more to Nathaniel's past, and more to the ranch she had been trying to leave behind. Joanna was no stranger to loss, to trauma, but this was something new. It wasn't just the death of her mother, or the burnout from years of grueling work in the emergency room. It was a deeper, older kind of grief that was tied to something intangible, something buried in the soil of Lost Valley itself. As she placed a damp cloth on Nathaniel's forehead, he stirred, his brow furrowing as if in pain. He muttered something unintelligible, his voice weak but filled with an unmistakable urgency. "I have to find him." His words were barely audible, but Joanna caught them. "Find who?" she asked softly, not expecting a coherent answer. But Nathaniel's response was clear. My son, Robert." His voice cracked as he spoke the name, his hands trembling. He disappeared. They said he ran off, but I know he didn't. He knew too much." Joanna's breath caught in her throat. There was something in his words, something that resonated with the questions she had been carrying all her life. About her mother, about the things left unsaid. She'd heard whispers in town over the years, whispers about the Creed family, about a scandal that had never been fully explained. But it was the name Robert that seemed to unlock something in her. There was an old ache, a long-forgotten pain tied to that name. But Joanna couldn't quite place it. She hadn't heard it before, but it felt strangely familiar. Her hands shook as she worked to stabilize Nathaniel. She wanted to ask more questions, to press him for details, but she knew he wasn't in any condition to answer them. Instead, she did what she had done countless times before in her career as a nurse. She focused on the task at hand. She gave him more water, checked his vitals, and adjusted the blanket around him. But her mind kept racing back to his words. He knew too much. The phrase echoed in her head as if it were a key that could unlock everything. After a while, Nathaniel seemed to fall into a deeper sleep, his breathing slow and steady. Joanna sat beside him, staring at the fire as it crackled low in the hearth. The flames flickered and danced, casting long shadows across the room. Her eyes kept drifting toward the window, where she could just make out the figure of the Mustang standing still at the edge of the clearing. Its eyes glowed faintly in the fading light, a steady, watchful presence. It was then that Joanna realized something. She had followed the Mustang, but the horse had never led her in any clear direction. It had simply been there, guiding her with its presence, nudging her toward something deeper, something unknown. And now, standing at the threshold of the cabin, she felt it again, a sense of urgency, of unfinished business. The Mustang wasn't just an animal. It was a messenger. As the night stretched on, Joanna couldn't sit still. She needed to see more, to understand what the horse had led her to. After a moment's hesitation, she stood and grabbed her coat. Nathaniel was asleep, and the cabin was still, save for the occasional groan of wood settling under the weight of the snow. She quietly stepped out the door, the cold air biting at her skin, but the chill didn't stop her. The Mustang was still there, standing just outside the clearing, as though it had been waiting for her. She followed it. The path that led her down was barely visible, overgrown and winding through thick brush. It was a trail she had never noticed before, hidden among the trees like some forgotten secret. The Mustang's presence was a constant in the darkness, guiding her without a sound. The air seemed to thicken with every step, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Eventually, the Mustang stopped. Joanna followed it through a tangle of branches and brambles until they came upon a small ravine, its sides steep and jagged. At the base of the ravine was a small pile of rocks, a crude marker buried beneath the earth. Joanna knelt down, brushing the dirt aside. What she uncovered took her breath away. A lockbox, rusted, old, and covered in layers of dirt. She lifted it carefully, her hands trembling. The lock was old, but it yielded to her touch. And when she opened it, the contents nearly spilled out. Inside were land deeds, some dating back decades, and a collection of papers, handwritten in a shaky script. It was clear they had been hidden here for a long time. But what caught Joanna's attention the most were the photographs, black and white images of people she didn't recognize. But one in particular stood out. It was a picture of a young man, his face angular and sharp, with dark eyes that seemed to stare right through her, or Robert Creed. The name seemed to echo in her mind as the Mustang stood nearby, watching her. The horse had led her to this moment, to the truth that had been buried for years. There was more to Nathaniel's son's disappearance than anyone had known, more to the Creed family's legacy than had ever been spoken. As Joanna stood up, the weight of the discovery settled in her chest. This was no longer about leaving. This was about finding the truth. And something deep inside her knew that this was just the beginning. The night had stretched on longer than Joanna had anticipated, but the discovery of the lockbox buried beneath the earth had filled her with an uneasy sense of purpose. The Mustang stood by, watching her every movement as if it understood the gravity of what she had uncovered. She could no longer deny it. This wasn't just a trip back to Lost Valley for closure. There was something here, something she was meant to find. The past was reaching out, pulling her in, and she had no choice but to follow its trail. As the first light of morning crept through the dense trees, Joanna made her way back to the cabin with the lockbox in hand. The Mustang followed her silently, a constant, steady presence at her side. When she stepped into the cabin, the warmth from the fire was a welcome relief, but it did little to calm the rising storm inside her. Nathaniel was still unconscious, his breathing steady but shallow. His frailty was more apparent now, his skin thin and translucent, like something worn and fragile, pushed to the edges of time. As Joanna sat by his side again, placing the lockbox on the table beside him, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were both clinging to something lost, a truth that had been buried, forgotten, and now begged to be remembered. She opened the lockbox carefully, the rusted hinges creaking in protest. Inside, along with the faded photographs and land deeds, were letters, handwritten, aged, and stained with time. She gently unfolded the first letter, her fingers trembling as she read the faded ink. "Dad, if you're reading this, I didn't make it out. I knew too much. They were going to silence me, and they did." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. The voice in the letter was familiar. There was no mistaking it. It was Robert Creed's handwriting, the son Nathaniel had been searching for, the son who had vanished so many years ago. The letter was a final message, a plea for his father to understand the truth. But what truth? Joanna felt her heart race as she read on. "I uncovered the lies about the Creed family, about the land, the wealth, and the shady dealings that made it all possible. They can't let the truth get out, and I'm the one who knows it all. Please, Dad, don't let them erase me." Joanna sat back in her chair, the letter in her hands trembling. It wasn't just some wild conspiracy. This was real. This was something that had been buried for decades, hidden behind the idyllic image of the Creed family's legacy. Robert had uncovered something so damning that it had led to his disappearance. And now, somehow, the Mustang, this wild, haunting creature, had led Joanna to the very heart of it. She looked over at Nathaniel, still lying in a fragile slumber. His face, once strong and proud, was now weathered by time, marked by the pain of loss. She had seen this look before, in the eyes of the people she treated in the ER, in the faces of those who had lost everything, those who carried a grief too heavy to bear. But Nathaniel's grief wasn't just for a lost son. It was for a truth he had never known, a truth that had been hidden from him all these years. Joanna needed answers. She needed to understand what Robert had discovered and why it had cost him everything. But Nathaniel was too weak to offer much insight. He was lost in a fog of confusion, his mind clouded by years of regret and unanswered questions. As she sat there, the Mustang's presence in the doorway caught her attention. The horse was still standing watch, its wild eyes glowing softly in the morning light. It had led her to the lockbox, but the Mustang wasn't just a guide. It was a witness to the events that had shaped this place, a silent guardian of the secrets buried here. Joanna's fingers lingered over the next letter, and with a deep breath, she unfolded it, determined to uncover the rest of the story. It was another message from Robert. They don't want anyone to know what really happened here. The land, the wealth, it was all built on lies. I've seen the documents. I know who's behind it all, the people in charge. They'll do anything to keep this quiet. Please, Dad. You have to stop them. Her heart pounded in her chest as she finished reading. The documents? What documents? What was Robert talking about? She glanced at the land deeds, scattered across the table. Could they hold the key to everything? Joanna looked back at Nathaniel, still unconscious, and then back at the Mustang, which seemed to be watching her every move with those penetrating eyes. And the pieces were slowly starting to fall into place. The Mustang hadn't just led her to the cabin, it had led her to the truth. But the truth was dangerous. Robert had paid the ultimate price for it, and Joanna had no idea what kind of danger she might be walking into. As the minutes ticked by, Nathaniel began to stir, his eyes fluttering open. His gaze met hers, and for a moment, Anster, it was as if he was seeing her for the first time. He was still disoriented, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. You found them, didn't you? He rasped, his voice hoarse from dehydration. The letters. The truth. Joanna nodded, swallowing hard. Yes, I've read them. Nathaniel's face contorted with emotion, pain, regret, and something else. Fear. He knew the danger of what they were uncovering. But he didn't say anything for a long while, just staring at the floor as if searching for the right words. Finally he spoke, his voice trembling. Oh, I thought I had lost everything, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I was wrong. I lost the truth, and that's what's been eating me alive all these years. Joanna's heart tightened. She could see it now, the weight Nathaniel had carried for so long. The loss of his son, the mystery of Robert's disappearance, and the secrets that had been buried in this land, hidden beneath the guise of a perfect family legacy. She placed the letters back into the lockbox and closed it gently. It wasn't just about Nathaniel's grief anymore. It was about something far bigger, a truth that had been buried for too long, something that needed to be uncovered no matter the cost. The Mustang had led her here, and now Joanna knew she couldn't walk away. She had to find out the full story. She had to finish what Robert had started. And with that realization, she knew her life in Lost Valley was far from over. The air inside the cabin grew colder as the hours passed, the fire crackling low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The cabin itself seemed to be holding its breath, as if waiting for something. Joanna sat at the worn wooden table, the lockbox now resting before her. The weight of the letters, the photographs, and the land deeds sat heavy in her hands. The weight of the truth pressing on her chest like a vice. As Nathaniel had fallen into a fitful sleep again, his breath shallow and strained. She had done all she could for him, but it was clear that his body was weak, his spirit more fragile than ever. His past, one that he had buried deep within himself, had returned with a vengeance. And it was slowly unraveling everything he thought he knew. Joanna couldn't help but feel that this moment, this discovery, wasn't just about Nathaniel or his son. It was about the entire legacy of Lost Valley, the dark, hidden truths buried beneath the surface of the sleepy town, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover them. She ran her fingers over the lockbox, feeling its cold, rusted edges. The whispers of the past seemed to seep through the walls of the cabin as if the very structure itself held the memories of those who had come before. Joanna had always believed in ghosts, the ones that haunt the living, the ones that couldn't rest until their stories were told. But what she was uncovering now wasn't about restless spirits. It was about a legacy of secrets, lies, and betrayal, and it was all tied to the land. The Mustang's presence outside was a constant reminder. The horse, wild and untamable, had appeared at the right moment, at the moment when Joanna needed guidance the most. It had led her to the cabin, to Nathaniel, and now it was leading her deeper into the mystery. But the Mustang wasn't just a guide. It was a keeper of secrets. Joanna could feel that it knew something more, something that hadn't yet been revealed. She stood up from the table, her mind racing with questions. She couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that the cabin had more to offer. She had already discovered the letters and the photographs, but there was something in the back of her mind telling her that there was more hidden here, something that would bring everything together. Without thinking, she moved toward the back of the cabin, where an old wooden cupboard stood against the wall. It was dusty and neglected, as if no one had touched it in years. Joanna hesitated for a moment, wondering if she was just grasping at straws. But something in the air told her that this was it, that whatever she was looking for was close. She reached for the cupboard door, her fingers brushing against the cold wood. As she opened it, a faint creak filled the room, and she found herself staring at an array of old objects, mismatched dishes, cracked jars, and faded knickknacks. But something caught her eye at the back of the cupboard. A loose floorboard, just visible beneath the clutter. Joanna's breath caught in her throat. The sight of the floorboard seemed almost deliberate, as if someone had hidden it on purpose, knowing that one day someone would come looking. She knelt down, her fingers trembling as she pried at the edge of the board. It came loose with a soft snap, revealing a small, shallow compartment beneath. Her heart pounded as she reached inside, pulling out a tin box, old, rusted, and covered in a thick layer of dust. The box was small, about the size of a shoebox, but it was surprisingly heavy. She sat back on her heels, staring at the box for a moment before opening it. Inside were more letters, handwritten, like the ones she had already found, but these were different. They were written on thicker paper. The ink darker, and the handwriting was sharper, more deliberate. The first letter she unfolded sent a chill down her spine. To my son, if you ever find this, know that I am sorry. What I did to you and to our family can never be undone. The truth about the Creed legacy is more dangerous than you can imagine. I hope you never have to uncover it. I wish I could have spared you. Please forgive me. Joanna's pulse quickened as she read the letter, her eyes scanning the words over and over. This letter wasn't written by Robert. It was written by Nathaniel. A letter to his son, one that had been hidden for years. She sat in stunned silence, trying to absorb the weight of what she had just read. Nathaniel had known. He had known something all along, something he had kept from his son. The truth about the Creed family legacy wasn't just about land deals and financial crimes. It was about something much darker, something that had been kept buried for decades. Nathaniel had tried to shield his son from it, but it seemed the damage was already done. As she read on, the truth began to unfurl itself in the most unexpected ways. The land that we own, our wealth, was built on blood, on the sacrifice of those who were too weak to fight back. The dealings that made the Creed family what it is today were not born out of hard work or luck. They were born from greed, manipulation, and violence. I should have told you, Robert, but I thought I could protect you from it. I thought I could shield you from the truth. But now I see that I was wrong. You are old enough to know. You must understand before it destroys everything. Joanna's hands shook as she folded the letter back into the tin box. This was it, the heart of the story, the thing that had been hidden for so long. It wasn't just about the financial crimes that Robert had uncovered. It was about the very foundation of the Creed family's wealth, built on the exploitation of others, on something far more sinister than Joanna had ever imagined. The room seemed to spin as the weight of the truth settled over her. The Mustang's presence outside, the letters, the hidden compartments, all of it had led her here, to this moment, to this discovery. She had been searching for answers, but now Joanna realized that she wasn't just uncovering the past. She was unearthing a legacy of pain, violence, and greed that had haunted the valley for generations. The land was tied to that history, and so was Nathaniel. And now, so was she. The whispers of the past had grown louder, and Joanna knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Joanna sat still, the tin box open before her, its contents scattering across the table like a puzzle that demanded her attention. Each letter, each photograph, and each piece of paper seemed to have a life of its own, pulling her deeper into a story she wasn't prepared for. But there was no turning back now. She had crossed a threshold, and the truth had a way of demanding to be known, no matter how painful or destructive it might be. As the Mustang stood just beyond the cabin's threshold, its gaze unbroken, Joanna realized the weight of what she had discovered. She wasn't just uncovering Nathaniel's past or the fate of his son, Robert. She was uncovering the truth about the land, the foundation of the Creed family's wealth, and the terrible things that had been done to build it. And it was all tied to the land, to the very place she had tried so hard to leave behind. Nathaniel's breathing was shallow, and his eyes fluttered as he slowly stirred from his restless sleep. His fevered mind had clearly been drifting between past and present, memories tangled in confusion. But something had shifted in him. The words from the letter, the ones he had written to his son, seemed to be breaking through the veil of his memory. When he looked at Joanna now, there was a new clarity in his eyes, as if the pieces of the past had started to fall into place for him just as they had for her. Joanna's pulse quickened, and the Mustang's presence, like a silent sentinel, made her feel like the answers she was seeking were just within her reach, if only she could understand them. Nathaniel's voice, raspy and weak, broke the silence. "You found it, didn't you?" Joanna nodded slowly, her throat tight with emotion. "Yes, I did. I found your letter. The one to Robert." Nathaniel's eyes grew distant, and he turned his face away from her, as if ashamed. "I wrote that a long time ago, before I realized how far gone I was. I thought I could keep him safe. I thought I could shield him from the truth. But now..." His voice cracked, and he struggled to continue. "Now I realize I failed him." Joanna's heart twisted in her chest as she watched Nathaniel wrestle with the guilt that had consumed him for so long. "You didn't know, Nathaniel," she said softly. "You couldn't have known what would happen." He shook his head, his thin, shaking hands clutching the edge of the table. "I should have told him. I should have warned him about the dangers of uncovering the truth. But I didn't. And now Robert is gone because of it." Joanna's thoughts raced, her mind replaying the words she had just read in the letter. The truth about the Creed family's legacy, about the land, the wealth, the greed, and the violence that had sustained it. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a personal tragedy for Nathaniel. This was a family, a town, a history built on a lie. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. She glanced out of the cabin's small window, where the Mustang still stood, its presence commanding and steadfast. It hadn't moved, and its eyes remained locked on hers. It was as if the animal was waiting for her to understand, waiting for her to hear the truth that the land had been trying to whisper all along. Joanna stood up and moved toward the old cassette tape she had found earlier, tucked among the papers in the lockbox. The label on the cassette read, "For Dad, in case I disappear." Her hands shook as she picked it up, wondering what secrets the tape might reveal. Was this Robert's final message, a warning to his father, or something more? The weight of it felt like a direct link to everything that had happened, like a key that might unlock the final door to the truth. She turned the old cassette player on, the familiar clicking sound filling the room, and placed the tape inside. The machine sputtered for a moment before the soft crackling of static filled the air. Then a voice, deep and familiar, yet strained, began to speak. "Dad, if you're hearing this, I probably didn't make it out. I was never a liar, Dad. I just knew too much." Joanna's breath caught in her throat. The voice was unmistakable. It was Robert. She could hear the fear in his tone, the urgency that had been present in his words, and the deep sadness that echoed through them. The tape continued to play, and Joanna could hear Robert's words, clear and concise, even as they trembled with the weight of their meaning. I uncovered the truth about the Creed family. The land we own, the wealth we've built, it was all founded on lies, on exploitation. There's a trail of blood, Dad, and it stretches back further than you can imagine. You need to understand. They will do whatever it takes to protect this lie. They've silenced me, but I won't be the last. The words hung in the air, and Joanna's mind raced to process them. Robert had discovered the truth, the ugly, buried truth about the Creed family's rise to power, about the wealth that had been built on exploitation, and the lives that had been destroyed in the process. And now, Robert had paid the price for knowing too much. Nathaniel's eyes were wide, his expression filled with disbelief and horror as he listened to the tape. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He was frozen in place, his mind clearly struggling to process what he was hearing. Joanna knew what it meant. The truth Robert had uncovered was far darker than anything either of them had imagined. When the tape stopped, the room fell silent once again. The weight of the revelation hung heavily in the air. Joanna felt a sense of responsibility welling up inside her. This was more than just Nathaniel's redemption. This was about the entire town, the history of Lost Valley, and the truth that had been buried for far too long. She turned toward Nathaniel, her voice soft but firm. We have to make this right. We have to bring the truth to light. It's the only way to honor Robert's memory, and stop this from happening again. Nathaniel looked at her, his face pale and drawn. But there was something in his eyes now, a flicker of resolve. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to face what I'd been a part of. But you're right. We can't let Robert's death be in vain. Joanna nodded, her resolve strengthening. She could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her. But she also felt a sense of clarity. The truth was no longer something to fear. It was something to embrace. And with that, she knew what she had to do next. The morning light filtered through the dense trees of Lost Valley, casting a soft, golden glow over the cabin. The Mustang, still a silent, watchful presence just outside, seemed to stir with the first rays of dawn, its coat gleaming in the early light. Its steady gaze never wavered, never faltered, as if it understood what was coming. And Joanna, after hearing Robert's tape and uncovering the dark secrets of the Creed family legacy, knew that the Mustang was more than just an animal. It was a guide. And now, it was leading her to the next step of the journey. Joanna had spent the night awake, thinking through everything she had learned. The letters, the photographs, the tape, and the truth that Robert had died for. The land, the wealth, the blood that had been spilled to create the empire of the Creed family. It all weighed heavily on her, more than she had ever imagined possible. She had thought she was leaving this town behind, but it seemed as though Lost Valley wouldn't let her go so easily. Nathaniel had finally fallen into a deeper sleep, his body exhausted from the fever that had ravaged him. The truth, once so carefully hidden, had broken through in a flood of memories and realizations. Nathaniel, who had spent so many years in denial about his family's past, was now facing the consequences of his silence. The guilt was eating away at him, and Joanna knew that there was little she could do to ease the burden he carried. But the Mustang, this wild, untamed creature, had given her something more. A path forward. The Mustang's return, standing as if it had been waiting for her to take the next step, told Joanna that her journey was far from over. It wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. It was about confronting it, about bringing it to light. As she stepped outside, the cool air of early morning brushed against her skin. The Mustang stood still, watching her with its piercing gaze, as though it had known this moment would come. Joanna hesitated for only a moment before she made her way toward the horse. She wasn't sure why, but she felt compelled to follow it again, to see where it would lead her. It had brought her to the cabin, to the lockbox, to the hidden letters, and to the truth about Robert's disappearance. It had shown her the depth of the Creed family's sins, but there was something more, something the horse was guiding her toward. The Mustang began to move, its hooves tapping lightly against the ground as it trotted toward a narrow trail at the edge of the clearing. It glanced back, ensuring Joanna was following, before it plunged into the thick woods, weaving between the towering pines with graceful ease. Joanna followed without hesitation. The path was overgrown, the brambles scratching at her skin as she moved deeper into the forest, but she didn't care. The Mustang knew where it was going, and she trusted it. As they moved deeper into the woods, the air grew heavier, as if the very land was steeped in secrets, holding its breath as they passed. The Mustang didn't falter, its movements fluid and sure, as though it had walked this path countless times before. The forest seemed to open up ahead, revealing a hidden, overgrown trail that hadn't been walked in years. After what felt like hours of walking, the Mustang finally stopped. Joanna's breath came in quick bursts as she approached the clearing ahead, her heart pounding with anticipation. What was it that the horse had brought her to? She had no idea, but she felt certain that the answer was close. The clearing ahead was small, surrounded by dense trees and thick underbrush, but in the center of the clearing stood something unexpected, a weathered, half-buried structure, its stone walls crumbling with age. It looked like a small stone building, but its purpose was unclear. Had this been here all along, or had it been hidden by the land, waiting for someone to uncover it? Joanna stepped forward, her boots crunching softly on the ground as she approached the entrance. The door to the small stone structure was ajar, and as she pushed it open, she felt a rush of cool air and the weight of history press against her chest. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves, though most of the shelves had long since fallen into disrepair. Papers and books were scattered around the room, some faded with age, others torn and nearly unreadable. But at the center of the room, beneath a pile of dust and rubble, was something that caught her attention: a locked chest, its metal surface tarnished with age. Her heart raced as she approached the chest. She didn't know what it contained, but she knew it had to be important. The Mustang had let her ear, and now, this was the moment to uncover whatever secrets lay inside. She knelt down and with trembling hands tried to open the chest. It was locked, but she could feel the faint vibrations of something inside, something that had been waiting for her to find it. With one swift motion, she wrenched open the chest, the lock falling away with a sharp snap. Inside, there was a small collection of papers, several old maps, and another set of photographs. Photographs that seemed to belong to a different time. These weren't the same images of Robert or Nathaniel. These were older. These were images of the land, of Lost Valley, before the Creeds had come. But it was the final item in the chest that made her breath catch. A ledger, old, fragile, and filled with handwritten entries. As she flipped through the pages, Joanna felt the weight of each word. These weren't just family records. These were accounts of land transactions, of people displaced, of deals made in secret under the cover of darkness. The truth, once again, was right in front of her. The Creeds hadn't just built their wealth on lies. They had built it on the backs of others. The land they had stolen, the lives they had destroyed, it was all documented here in this ledger, in black and white. The sins of the Creed family laid bare for the world to see. Joanna closed the ledger, her hands shaking as she realized the magnitude of what she had just uncovered. She had come here for answers. But what she had found was more than she could have imagined. And the Mustang, ever the silent guide, had led her to this moment. As she stood there, staring at the ledger, she knew what she had to do. The truth couldn't remain buried any longer. She had to bring it to light, and with that decision, the Mustang, as if sensing the shift, gave one last look and disappeared into the trees. its figure vanishing into the mist. The journey back to town was heavier than Joanna had anticipated. The morning's discovery in the hidden stone building had altered something deep within her. The Mustang's presence had faded, but its guidance had left a lasting impression. The ledger she had uncovered in the chest, a meticulously documented history of the Creed family's rise to power, built on lies, manipulation, and the exploitation of the people who once lived on the land, was in her hands now. This truth, buried for so long, was not just her discovery. It was the town's discovery. It was Robert's legacy, and she could no longer turn away from it. As she walked toward the cabin, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the land. The town of Lost Valley seemed like a distant memory, but the weight of the truth she was carrying made it feel closer than ever. Nathaniel had finally stirred from his feverish slumber. His mind was clearer now, his face more composed as he processed the weight of what they had found together. His once defiant silence had given way to the hard reality of what his family had been responsible for. Joanna could see the guilt in his eyes now. It was a pain that could never fully be undone, but now there was no going back. They had to face the town. They had to expose the truth. When the Yale cabriolet arrived at the outskirts of Lost Valley, the town was quiet, its main street nearly deserted. It was late afternoon, and the few townspeople who were still about barely glanced at them as they passed. It was the same sleepy town Joanna remembered from her childhood, unremarkable, forgotten by time. But underneath the surface, things were about to change forever. Joanna had always felt out of place here, like a bird that didn't belong in its nest. Her family's past was tangled with the history of this town, but it wasn't the kind of history people like to talk about. Now, she was bringing it back into the light, and she could already feel the tension building, the weight of her decision pressing down on her shoulders. They walked toward the town hall, the place where all the decisions of Lost Valley had been made, or hidden, as was the case for the last several decades. Nathaniel's steps were slow and deliberate, his head hung low in shame. Joanna, on the other hand, walked with a firm resolve. She had no choice now. The truth had to be told. As they entered the town hall, the small, dusty space seemed to pause. The local officials, gathered around a weathered wooden table, looked up at them, their faces blank with indifference, until they saw the ledger in Joanna's hands. The room went silent. Joanna Ray, the mayor, a tall man with graying hair and a stiff collar, said, his voice tinged with surprise, "What brings you here today?" Joanna's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped forward, Nathaniel beside her, his frailty still evident. She could see the skepticism in the eyes of the townspeople, the dismissive glances as they tried to size her up. They had always thought of her as an outsider, just a girl who had run away from her roots. But now she was back, and she was armed with something they couldn't ignore. "I'm here to show you the truth," she said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet fury. "The truth about the land, about the creeds, and about everything this town has been built on." The mayor raised an eyebrow, clearly unsure of what to expect. "What are you talking about?" Joanna opened the ledger, the brittle pages creaking as she turned them. She didn't need to explain it in detail. The evidence was there, in black and white. She set the ledger down on the table in front of the town officials. "This is a record of the land transactions, the dealings that built the Creed family empire, and it's all been built on lies, on land stolen from people who had no choice but to give it up." There was a collective gasp as the room took in the weight of her words. The mayor and the others exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence slipping. But one man, a local business owner who had been a pillar of the town's old guard, spoke up. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice wavering. "The Creeds have been the backbone of this town for generations. Without them, there wouldn't even be a town." Joanna turned toward him, her gaze sharp. "You're right. Without the Creeds, there wouldn't be a town. But this town was built on the suffering of others. The Creeds didn't just buy land, they stole it. They used manipulation, threats, and violence to acquire what they wanted. And Robert Creed, Nathaniel's son, he knew it. That's why he disappeared. Nathaniel, standing beside her, suddenly looked up, and his eyes filled with raw emotion. My son tried to stop it. He tried to expose the truth, but they silenced him before he could. The room grew quiet, the gravity of his words hanging in the air. And the mayor's face paled as he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He cleared his throat. So, you're saying, Robert, he was killed because he found out something about, the land? Joanna nodded. Yes. And it wasn't just Robert. It's everyone who's ever been in the way of the Creed family's ambitions. The truth about the land, the people it was taken from, and the lies that have been buried for decades, it's all here, in this ledger. The mayor stood up slowly, his hands gripping the edge of the table. This is a serious accusation, Joanna. You can't just sweep it under the rug anymore, she interrupted. The truth is out, and you're going to have to face it. For the first time since she had walked into the room, there was no dismissive glance, no scoffing smirk. The town officials were silent, the weight of the evidence sinking in. They knew, just as she did, that this was the end of an era for Lost Valley. No one would look at the Creed name the same way again. And no one would look at the town the same way either. Joanna's heart raced, but she could feel a sense of finality in the air. The truth had been revealed, and now there was no going back. As the room fell into an uncomfortable silence, Joanna turned to Nathaniel, who stood beside her, a man broken by the weight of his family's sins. But for the first time in years, he seemed like a man ready to face his past. The Mustang had led her here, and now she would stay and fight for the truth. The room in the town hall was suffocating with tension. The ledger lay between Joanna and the town officials like a heavy, immovable object, its pages filled with damning evidence. The mayor and the other town leaders had been left speechless, their earlier dismissiveness replaced by a palpable unease. The once untouchable legacy of the Creed family, which had held the town in its grip for decades, was now crumbling before their eyes. Joanna stood there, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on her. She had done what she came here to do. She had exposed the truth, the dirty secrets of the Creed family, the land they had stolen, and the violence and manipulation that had ensured their empire remained unchallenged. Robert had known it all, and it had cost him everything. The Mustang had led her to the heart of the truth, and now there was no turning back. Yet, despite the gravity of the situation, Joanna felt a strange sense of peace. It was as though a chapter of her life, a chapter filled with unanswered questions and buried pain, had finally come to an end. Her mother's legacy, her own past, and the questions that had haunted her for years were all wrapped up in the discoveries she had made. And now, with the truth exposed, she knew that she could leave Lost Valley, at least emotionally, once and for all. But before she could consider her next move, there was a sound from outside, a low, steady thud of hooves against the earth. The door to the town hall creaked open, and there, standing in the doorway, was the Mustang. It had returned. Joanna's heart skipped a beat. She had almost forgotten about the horse, but now it stood there, its gray coat shining in the fading light of the afternoon, its eyes glowing with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. The Mustang wasn't just a symbol of the past. It had become part of her journey, a silent companion who had led her to the truth. The room fell silent again. The town officials, still processing the enormity of what Joanna had just revealed, now turned their gaze to the horse. The Mustang's presence seemed almost surreal, as if it had always belonged there, standing in the very place where the Creed family's power had once been unquestioned. Joanna took a step forward, her eyes locked with the horse's. She had followed it into the woods, through the dark secrets of her family's history, and now it stood before her as if waiting for something. She wasn't sure what it wanted, but she knew it was not here by accident. The Mustang had been leading her all along. One of the town officials, a younger man who had been sitting in the back, finally broke the silence. Is that your horse?" he asked, his voice hesitant, as though he feared to acknowledge the weight of the question. Joanna shook her head. "No," she replied softly, her voice carrying more weight than the words themselves. "He's not mine. He's never belonged to anyone." The mayor, still stunned by the events unfolding, took a step forward, his voice shaky. "Then why is he here? Why now, after everything that's been revealed?" Joanna looked at the Mustang once more, feeling the depth of its presence. It had always been there, watching her, guiding her. She didn't know why it had chosen her, but in a way, she felt connected to it. It had been the one constant through all the twists and turns of her journey. The Mustang let out a soft whinny, its mane swaying gently in the breeze. It looked directly at Joanna, and in that moment she felt something stir within her. A sense of understanding, of closure. "It's not just about the land," Joanna said, her voice steady and calm as she addressed the room full of town officials. "It's about what's been forgotten, what's been buried. The Mustang has been here longer than any of us. It has witnessed everything, the greed, the violence, the manipulation. But it also represents something else, freedom. It never belonged to anyone. It's always been wild, untamed, just like the truth that's been hidden here." The mayor took a step back, his expression filled with confusion. "You're saying this horse is a symbol?" Joanna nodded, slowly. "A symbol of what has been lost, and of what needs to be reclaimed?" The room fell into a heavy silence as the Mustang slowly turned and began to walk back toward the door, its hooves making soft, rhythmic sounds on the old wooden floor. It stopped just outside, at the edge of the town hall, and paused for a moment, as though waiting for something, waiting for everyone to understand. Joanna watched as the Mustang disappeared into the trees, its form fading into the shadows. It was as if the horse had fulfilled its purpose, guiding her to the truth, and now finally stepping aside. But before it disappeared completely, it paused one last time, its head turned toward her. Joanna locked eyes with it, and in that brief moment, something passed between them. It was a silent acknowledgement, a mutual understanding of what had been accomplished. With a final glance, the Mustang vanished into the woods, leaving the town hall in complete silence. Joanna turned back to the room, full of stunned officials. The town's secrets had been exposed. The truth about the Creed family's rise to power lay bare for all to see. But the Mustang's departure had left something else in its wake, something deeper, a sense of finality. The past could no longer be hidden. The legacy of the Creeds, for better or worse, was now out in the open. As the mayor and the other officials stood there, unsure of how to proceed, Joanna knew what she had to do. The Mustang had led her to this point, and now it was time for her to leave it behind. To finally let go of the past and begin a new chapter. She looked at Nathaniel, who stood beside her, his face drawn but resolute. They had both lost something in this journey. Their pasts, their illusions of the Creed family's legacy, but they had also gained something, a chance at redemption, a chance to honor Robert's memory by bringing the truth to light. Joanna took a deep breath and turned toward the door. It was time to leave Lost Valley. It was time to move on. But as she stepped out into the evening light, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The town might never be the same. But for her, the journey had ended. The truth had been set free. And with that, she knew sometimes the things that are meant to set us free don't need to belong to anyone. They just need to be allowed to run wild. The sun had just dipped below the horizon when Joanna Ray stood at the edge of Lost Valley, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. The town, once a place of bitter memories and unresolved grief, now felt like a distant echo, a part of her past that she had left behind. The wind stirred the air, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth, the same scent that had greeted her when she first returned to the ranch. But now, there was a sense of peace, a stillness that hadn't existed before. She stood alone, but not truly alone. Nathaniel had stayed behind, still processing the revelation of his family's dark legacy. His heart, once burdened by years of guilt and denial, was now slowly beginning to heal. He had been a prisoner of the past for so long, but today he had faced the truth, and in doing so, he had reclaimed a part of himself. But there was still work to be done. His redemption wouldn't come all at once, but it had begun. Joanna turned her back to the town and the ranch she had been so eager to escape. The memories were still there, tucked away in the corners of her mind, but they no longer had the power to hold her captive. The Mustang had played its part, leading her to the truth, guiding her through the maze of her family's legacy and the town's secrets. And now, as the first stars began to twinkle in the twilight sky, Joanna knew it was time for her to move forward. She had come to Lost Valley to bury the past. Instead, she had unearthed it, revealing everything: the lies, the pain, the manipulation, and the quiet resilience of those who had been oppressed. And in doing so, she had found something else: her own strength. Her mother's voice, once a distant whisper in her memory, now felt like a steady presence, urging her to make the most of the life she still had. A few months had passed since that day in the town hall, when Joanna and Nathaniel had exposed the truth to the people of Lost Valley. The Creed family's legacy had been shaken to its core, and the town had been forced to reckon with the sins of the past. But the real work had only just begun. The town's residents, some of them complicit in the lies, others too afraid to speak out, now found themselves at a crossroads. Many had been shocked by the revelations, but some had embraced the opportunity for change, for accountability, for healing. The process was slow, but it had begun. Joanna had returned to the ranch one final time to clear out her mother's belongings, to sort through the memories that still clung to the walls. It was an emotional task, but it was one she knew she had to complete. The house, once filled with the echoes of her mother's presence, was now empty, save for the things that couldn't be taken with her: the old furniture, the family heirlooms, and the countless photographs that told a story of a life lived in quiet determination. But it was no longer her story to carry. As she stood in the middle of the old living room, looking around at the empty space, Joanna realized something profound. Her mother's legacy wasn't just the ranch or the house. It was the lessons she had taught her. The lessons of resilience, of standing up for what was right, even when it felt impossible. Her mother had been a woman who had carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, always putting others first, always pushing forward, even when the world seemed determined to hold her back. And in that moment, Joanna knew what she had to do. She couldn't erase the past. She couldn't undo the pain, the loss, the injustice, but she could build something new. She could create a space for healing, a place where people, whether they were from Lost Valley or beyond, could come to find peace, to find a sense of purpose, to find their own redemption. Joanna spent the next several weeks renovating the old cabin deep in the woods, the one where she had first found Nathaniel. The small, weathered building, tucked away from the rest of the world, became her sanctuary, a place where she could begin anew. She had always been drawn to horses, to the freedom they represented, and she realized that what the world needed now wasn't more conflict, more accusations, or more secrets. It needed healing. She began to turn the cabin into a small equine therapy center, a place where people could come to heal, to connect with nature, and to work through their own emotional struggles. The horses would serve as the bridge between the past and the future, guiding people toward a better understanding of themselves and the world around them. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was a start. The Mustang, which had led her on this journey, was never far from her thoughts. Though it had disappeared into the trees that day, its spirit lingered with her. She could still feel its presence, like a silent protector watching over her. And one day, perhaps, she would see it again. But for now, she knew her work was here, in the quiet of the cabin, with the horses, and with the people who would come seeking something she had finally found herself. Peace. Joanna had chosen to stay. It wasn't about fixing the past or erasing the pain. It was about listening to what had been left behind, honoring the legacy of those who had come before her, and finding her own path to healing. And in that journey, she knew she had found something far more important than justice. She had found the courage to stay, to remember, and to move forward. As the sun set over the valley, Joanna stood outside the cabin, looking out at the vast, rolling landscape before her. The Mustang would always be a part of her story, but now she was writing her own. The horses, the land, and the people of Lost Valley. These were the things she would build her future upon. The past might have shaped her, but it would no longer define her. And as she looked up at the stars, Joanna smiled softly, knowing that some horses, like some souls, weren't meant to be owned. They were meant to be honored, and in doing so, they would lead you to everything you needed.